Our hearts are broken. My heart is broken. A senseless act of violence, unprecedented in our country, has occurred.
It's not just an incident, it's a tragedy. It's something that no words can really describe.
The entire province and the entire country is grieving right now as we come to grips with something that is absolutely unimaginable.
We will wrap our arms around these families, and we will wrap our arms around these communities, and we will continue to be the caring, compassionate, kind, loving people we are to one another.
Nation is in mourning after terror and tragedy strikes rural Nova Scotia. Hi, and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Kapelos. At least 19 people have been killed, plus the suspected shooter in one of the deadliest attacks in Canada's history. Among the victims, a veteran RCMP officer and mother, a grade school teacher, a volunteer firefighter, and a 17-year-old girl who loved to play the violin. Police say the death toll could rise as they investigate 16 different crime scenes, some with homes burned down to the ground. It all began Saturday night in Portapique, about 90 minutes north of Halifax. People were warned to avoid the area and stay inside. By morning, a manhunt was underway for an active shooter who was dressed like an RCMP officer with a car disguised as a police cruiser. The 12-hour pursuit ended midday yesterday at a gas station in Enfield, just outside of Halifax. The suspect died shortly after being apprehended. Police are now investigating, as I mentioned, multiple crime scenes across many communities spanning about 50 kilometers. What more do we know about this attack, and what will the RCMP's investigation look like? Bill Blair is the Public Safety Minister, the minister responsible for the force. He joins us from the House of Commons. Hi, Minister Blair. Good to see you.
Hello, Vashi.
Thanks very much for being with us. I want to start off, sir. I knew you as Toronto's Chief of Police for a decade. You were a police officer for a number of years before that. I wanted to ask you, when you heard the news of especially Hadi Stevenson, an RCMP officer who was killed, there's another RCMP officer recovering who was wounded. What did you think when you heard that as a former police officer?
Actually, the first news I received was about the death of a police officer. And of course, for everyone who works in law enforcement, but also for communities and Canadians right across this country. That relationship with the police who serve us is a very special one, and of course that was tragic in circumstances. And then as we began to learn more of the details of how broad this particular tragedy was and how many people have been impacted, and of course I think we all are shocked and deeply grieving the loss of innocent life, and this is a very, very tragic event. But it doesn't define us, Vashi. It defines the offender, but it reminds us of all of those very worthwhile people and lives that have been lost.
Chris Leather, the Chief Superintendent for Nova Scotia's RCMP, said today, quote, "We will be in this for months to come." The police talk about investigating 16 crime scenes. Do the RCMP in that province have the resources they need to do that, Minister?
Yeah, we're mobilizing resources from across Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada and across the country to make sure that the RCMP have the resources they need to do this very important investigation. It's also very important to recognize, Vashi, that we're in the very earliest hours and days of this investigation. It's complex. It covers, as you know, at least 16 separate crime scenes over a 50-kilometer area. The RCMP have a great deal of work to do. They're working diligently, and they're working through their own grief as they get the answers and the evidence that they need to make sure that that community and all Canadians have a better understanding of what has actually happened. And that work is really important, and we'll do everything we can. I've been speaking a great deal to the Commissioner and to her officers about the work that they're doing. They will have our full support as they get Canadians the answers that we need to this terrible tragedy.
Minister, when you say that you're mobilizing forces or resources rather in Atlantic Canada as well as across the country, can you give us an idea of the scope, the size, exactly what you would be sending over to Nova Scotia to aid in the investigation?
Well, we're blessed in this country. One of the finest police services in the world is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they have an extraordinary capacity and expertise in the conduct of very complex criminal investigations, and those resources are available to them from across the country. And the Commissioner is working hard to make sure that the resources that are required in this investigation, the proper examination of all of those very complex crime scenes. There are literally thousands of people that need to be interviewed. They're working diligently to get the answers we need, and they have the resources and the support they need. And it's all we've also made it very clear. We've heard from the Canadian Armed Forces, from the province of Nova Scotia, from communities right across the country, everyone offering their help and their support to the important work that is now taking place.
I take the point, Minister. I guess I'm just wondering if there are, and I take it again also that it's very early in this, but is there a specific ask from the RCMP in Nova Scotia for a certain number of people to help in the investigation? Are people flying there right now? Can you give us a bit more specifics?
I can tell you there's expertise in Nova Scotia and in Atlantic Canada, but also right here in the National Capital Region. The RCMP is a national police service, and they have extraordinary capabilities and expertise in the conduct of such investigations, and the expertise that is required in Nova Scotia is making its way there or there. And I don't have precise numbers, but I have spoken to the Commissioner. She's mobilizing the extraordinary expertise within her own organization to respond to this. And frankly, that is a police service that I have had many years of experience with. Some of the finest police services and police officers anywhere in the world are working for the RCMP, and their very best people will be dedicated to getting the answers that we need on this investigation.
Minister, again, taking the point that you made and that RCMP leaders have made as well, that this is very early into the investigation. I have covered a number of other incidents in which RCMP officers were either killed and wounded. And of course, this takes many of us and our viewers back to the incident in Moncton, for example. I'm wondering at this point, at this stage of all of this, Minister, are you satisfied that RCMP officers involved had the equipment that they needed to deal with the situation?
Well, I'm not going to engage in any conjecture or speculation. It's really important that the RCMP conduct this investigation and they do it thoroughly and we get all the facts. And as we've already said, it's very early in this investigation, but the RCMP is out there doing their job. And one of the things I learned after many years of conducting complex investigations is what you know in the first few hours is often incomplete and sometimes inaccurate. And so it's important that we give the RCMP the time to gather their evidence, to get to the truth of what has transpired, and then we will deal effectively with what that evidence tells us.
With respect, Minister, I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm asking based on past incidents, which up until last year was even highlighted by the Auditor General, in which carbines, for example, specifically, were not made available to RCMP officers to the degree that they should have been, nor was the training there for them on that equipment. I'm not saying I have any idea if that's the case here, but is that a question that you have at this point? Are you satisfied that they had what they needed?
Listen, actually, we examined very carefully what transpired in Moncton and in Fredericton and in Meyerthorpe and in other places where police officers have lost their lives. I'm absolutely certain that those factors and that evidence will be examined thoroughly in this case. And again, I'm not going to speculate on what the outcome of that is. I know that there has been a great deal of work done in the RCMP to ensure that their people have the equipment and the training they need to respond to these types of events. But this particular event is unprecedented and tragic in its outcome. And so we'll wait for the RCMP to do its job, to provide us with the answers that we seek, and then we will respond appropriately to whatever information is uncovered.
Commissioner Lucky, Minister, also said that the suspect was not known. I think the question she was responding to was whether the RCMP knew of the suspect or the suspect was known. Not really known, I think, is what she said. Given the circumstances around this, the facts that we do know at this point, that he dressed up like a police officer, that he had a police cruiser, was he known to other members at all? Is there sort of a heightened level of alert, I guess, even for you as a former police officer, to someone who's doing this kind of thing?
I can tell you that I am quite confident that is forming part of the investigation and the inquiry that the RCMP are currently undertaking at those crime scenes. And they're going to look at every aspect of the circumstances that gave rise to this terrible event. And I'm certain that they'll look very thoroughly at what that implied and what might have been identified earlier in this investigation. But again, Vashti, I think it's important to let them gather that evidence, and when we have all the facts, we'll make a determination on what those facts tell us.
Is there something apart from this specific case, though, Minister, as the Minister in charge of the RCMP, that I guess is there a gut reaction for you to the idea that people are buying these cars or dressing up like the RCMP, just that can be allowed to happen?
Well, I'll tell you right now, my gut reaction is focused on the people of Nova Scotia who've been terribly traumatized and are grief-stricken over the loss of their friends and neighbors and family members. My thoughts are also with the RCMP who've lost a valued member and the officer who's recovering from his injuries. And of course, my thoughts are with those officers who are out there doing the difficult job of conducting this investigation and getting us the answers that we seek. And so we'll focus on that. And when we have all the facts, then we'll make a determination on what those facts tell us. And if there are lessons to be learned, we'll make sure that they're applied.
And our thoughts certainly are with all those RCMP members as well, Minister. It was a year ago that your government finished consultations on gun control. You received a lot of questions today about that legislation, and I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you said that you still intended to bring in that legislation, but after everything was done with the pandemic. How much of a priority is it going to be for your government, and should it have been, or do you regret not introducing it earlier?
Yeah, I just want to be very clear. We have been absolutely unequivocal in our commitment to bring about stronger gun control measures in this country. We ran on it in the last election, and we've been working tirelessly on it. That commitment is not in any way wavered. I also want to avoid any suggestion that this terrible tragedy should ever be politicized. We'll deal with the facts of this case, and it does not change our commitment to bring forward stronger gun control measures in this country. We're working full out on it, and we're going to bring that legislation forward as quickly as possible. What
does as quickly as possible mean? And I take into account, again, that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I remember interviewing you a year ago when the consultations for this were done. You spoke about it in the campaign, as did the Prime Minister. You were promising it in December on the anniversary of the tragedy at L'École Polytechnique. What kind of a priority is this for your government?
Well, I can tell you it's a very significant priority for the government. We have been working on it, and there are a number of measures that will be necessary, some of them regulatory, some of them through legislation. And I think clearly the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on the processes of Parliament has been impactful on the success we've had to date in bringing various matters forward, but it doesn't in any way undermine our commitment to making sure that we bring forward the measures that are necessary to keep Canadians safe and to strengthen gun control laws. The events of the past weekend and many, many other events that have taken place in this country and around the world tell us about the importance of effecting strong gun control measures, and we are absolutely committed to doing that.
Again, though, do you regret not doing it sooner?
Well, I'm looking forward here. First of all, there's an important investigation now taking place, and we're focused on that. And we know what we need to do with respect to firearms and to bring forward effective legislation to help keep Canadians safe, and we're going to work on that as fast and as effectively as possible.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Minister Blair. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Vashi.
RCMP in that province say this investigation could take months as they try to map out what happened and why, all while mourning the loss of one of their own and over a dozen others in surrounding communities. Pierre-Yves Bourduas is a former Deputy Commissioner for the RCMP. He joins us now from his home in Ottawa. Hi, Mr. Bourduas. Good to see you again.
Good afternoon, Vashi.
I wish it was under different circumstances. Let me start off with that first part about the breadth of the investigation. Months long, the RCMP signaled 16 different crime scenes. What does that tell you?
It's going to be a logistical nightmare for the RCMP. Of course, they can always tap onto additional resources coming from neighboring divisions. I'm thinking of identification services. I'm thinking of additional investigators that will try to map out exactly what happened, what actually preceded the tragedy, because a big question here is the motive. I mean, what prompted this individual to actually work? Because in my opinion, it's obviously was premeditated. He took time to prepare, have a vehicle that was a mock-up of an RCMP cruiser, along with the uniform. He obviously planned his trip to Portapique, and from there proceeded to create havoc for this small community. And I just can't picture, because I've worked in New Brunswick for over 20 years, and as a patrol officer, you answer to 911 calls at times. You get there, and then you see mayhem, you see death. You try to compute in your mind what's actually is happening here, all the while waiting for backups to show up. And then you need to investigate immediately. You need to address the threat. And the first responders must have been overwhelmed by what they actually witnessed. And to boot and to complicate the issue is the fact that the suspect that they were looking for was actually using a marked police vehicle that looked like one, and was just carrying and moving around, without a lot of questions being asked. So hence the reason why that investigation, as far as I'm concerned, was successful up to a certain point, because they were able to neutralize the threat before they actually, obviously the individual was aiming towards heading back towards Halifax, and the investigative response and the patrol officers were able to neutralize the threat before it reaches an urban environment, which in itself would have created a lot of problems.
The fact that he was in that marked up cruiser, that he was apparently dressed as an RCMP officer, have you come across that in your time in the Canadian context?
Not really, and I've thought about it, and I don't recall ever coming across something of that nature. Sometimes you'll see people that would try to impersonate RCMP officers, but to go to the details that this particular individual went through is quite remarkable. And so, of course, hence the reason why I'm thinking there was a lot of planning there. And the RCMP will, I'm sure, try to determine what triggered this particular individual to go down this path by probably looking at, and surely looking at his computer, who he was in communication with. And there was a question raised yesterday about COVID-19 and if there might have been a link with regards to his mental state. I understand that this individual was a dentalologist, and if the lockdown happened in, if I recall, about 3 weeks ago in Nova Scotia, it would allow this individual, because he was not actually seeing patient, to have more time to prepare for the tragic events that happened last Saturday evening.
Yeah, it's so difficult, Mr. Bourduas, because we really have no information other than he was dressed up and that the cruiser was, fashioned as a police cruiser. Other than that, I mean, you can't interview him, obviously. And it sounds like from Commissioner Lucky there wasn't a note or anything left, at least at this point, that they've seen. So figuring out his motive probably won't be easy. My guess, you'd know more. And
the RCMP will try, as an organization, to provide as many answers as possible to the grieving families, so it would help the grieving process, but also for the RCMPs to learn from the deployment of these the members out and about when this tragedy happened, because they need, and the organization will obviously need to learn from potential mistakes that might have been made as this tragedy unfolded on Sunday morning.
What about resources for the investigation itself? I had the public safety minister on a bit earlier, and he said that there would be some resources sent from across the country, from Atlantic Canada. You know Nova Scotia, you worked in New Brunswick, the size of the force there, the breadth of this investigation. How much help will they likely need?
Oh, they'll need, especially at the outset, to gather the evidence. It will be crucial, because they don't want to miss a single piece of evidence, because it would help actually build a chain of event that led to the neutralizing of the main suspect. But they will also need to ensure that there's nobody that actually helped or assisted, unbeknownst maybe to them, the suspect in conducting the unthinkable. So the RCMP will, I'm sure, left no stone unturned, and they're able to tap on a pool of knowledgeable resources, because the organization is 32,000 strong across the country with experts in a lot of various fields. And if they cannot get the experts, I'm sure, knowing the organization, they'll reach out to international experts just to make sure that they'll be able to have a clear picture as to what exactly transpired prior to the tragedy and following the tragedy, learning from these experiences.
I want to ask you one more thing that I was I don't know enough about, and I thought you were definitely the perfect person to help us understand. The RCMP said that they made 2 more referrals to the Serious Incident Response Team, CERT. That's on top of the referral that was made in regard to the death of the suspect. The RCMP's Commissioner Lucky, says no innocent civilians, though, were harmed. Why is CERT brought in?
Well, I suspect that it might have had something to do with a police officer interacting with the suspect at the time, either by using deadly force. And of course, the tragedy with regards to Constable Stevenson will probably require also an independent body to look at the surrounding events and what led to the tragedy and the loss of Constable Stevenson. So, of course, the RCMP, and I'm retired. I've been retired for 12 years, but I still feel every time I see this, and I feel like I'm actually lost a daughter, and that's how the RCMP feels. But they want to maintain an objective perspective, hence the reason why they're calling in independent investigators just to provide independent advice.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Heidi Stevenson, and just I wonder, given your experience and having lived through the loss of other members, if you could help our viewers understand how tough this is for such a close-knit force, especially I'm guessing, an extra close-knit in a small rural community.
Well, it's very, very difficult, but RCMP officers, by and large, will set aside their own personal feeling to be able to find the right answers for the grieving families, be it the grieving families for Constable Stevenson's and the other families, and they'll be professional. But the biggest challenge, and especially in a close-knit community, and for the RCMP family, is just to set aside your emotion and just go about your duty the way it's supposed to be done.
And I guess also with the nature of that community, just how small it is, does that have an impact on the investigation, compounded with the fact that we're in this COVID-19 time right now where everything is sort of different? There are new restrictions on our movement, on our distance between each other. Might that have an impact, do you think, on the investigation?
Well, for me, it's actually positive, because I'm thinking with my investigator's hat here, sometimes to meet people is challenging. Now you'll have people that ostensibly, if they respect the provincial rules and regulation policies, should be home. So for the RCMP, it should be a lot easier maintaining, of course, a social distancing to meet potential witnesses in relation to this particular tragedy.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Bourduas. Great pleasure to have you back on the program.
Always a pleasure, Vashi.
Pierre-Yves Bourduas is a former Deputy Commissioner for the RCMP. So, how monumental a task are RCMP investigators facing? Steve Marisink is a former major crimes investigator for the RCMP. He joins us from Edmonton. Hi, Mr. Marisink. Good to see you again.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to start off and ask you, when you listen to the details provided by the RCMP so far, what to you stands out? What are the salient details?
Just the terror, the horror of an event that took so many lives and that covered so much distance. When you've got an active shooter who's mobile in a vehicle, aggravated by the fact that it looked like a police vehicle, that's just a chaotic worst case scenario.
What do you mean by worst case scenario?
Well, you don't know whether the police vehicle approaching you is the right one, or if it's the individual who's impersonating an officer to facilitate his evil.
Have you ever dealt with anything like that?
No, never. And I would imagine that this manner of crime has been unprecedented, certainly to my knowledge.
16 different crime scenes, the RCMP said that it would take months to investigate all of them. Can you speak to how unprecedented that would be and the breadth, I guess, of the investigation ahead of them?
Well, it's going to be a massive investigation that's still taking legs right now. the RCMP have the ability to bring in resources from surrounding provinces and areas as they need them, and I have no doubt that those calls have gone out for assistance so that they can bring in the individuals with the crime scene experience and the major case management experience to bring their expertise to bear on 16 different scenes for now, and there may be more.
How common is it for RCMP, and we had the public safety minister on earlier who did say that resources would be moving from across the country into Nova Scotia. How common is that for a major crime like this?
You know, the RCMP have done that in the past. They have experience with bringing in resources from different divisions when they need them. That's one benefit of having that size of an organization. So that it's not uncommon. And whether they require tactical or major case management or forensic identification section, they will call on resources from around the country to ensure that they can examine the scenes there professionally and properly.
How significant is motive going to be, and how hard is it going to be to ascertain what that motive was?
Motive is always important, and I believe from my experience that the first victims that fell to this individual will be very telling in terms of what his motivation was. I believe that from what I've read and heard that as Chief Superintendent Leather has indicated, there were a number of random individuals, and I believe that the individual in this case was very directed. He had a goal, he wanted to accomplish it, and those that got in his way became collateral to him. And what that goal was should come out in terms of who his initial victims were.
And how big of a red flag is the, dressing up as an RCMP officer, outfitting a cruiser to look like a police cruiser, a car to look like a police cruiser, rather? How much of an alarm would that be for you?
Well, it speaks to a lot of planning and forethought. This was not a spur-of-the-moment event that this individual undertook. This would have required days, if not weeks, of planning and forethought. And what his motivation, whether this was anger, who knows, but he definitely put a lot of time. He would have had to have put a lot of time into it in order to make the mock-up of that police vehicle, to make the mock-up of the uniform. And again, what a more devious way to travel and to approach individuals to lower their guard.
What about what's happening right now, or obviously you're not there, but in your experience at this stage of the investigation, what could you tell our viewers about what might be happening behind the scenes?
Well, there's a lot of activity going on. There will be hundreds of members, men and women from the force, putting together teams to work on each crime scene. There will be a central repository, either out of Halifax or whether they've used it out of one of the district offices, who will be quarterbacking and managing this. And within a short period of time, they will have a process and establish that and move forward with that.
I know members of the force are immensely professional, but I can't imagine how difficult it is for them today to have to deal with the loss of one of their own. How does that compound the challenges in investigation?
I have a lot of confidence that the members that are involved will have that in the back of their mind. However, they also realize that their professionalism is being called on and their expertise is being called on, and that will be their focus. You have to be able to separate the reality and the horror of what you're dealing with the technical aspect and the work aspect of what you're doing. And those members would have those skill sets to do that.
How about yourself? What is it like as someone who spent a long time in the RCMP to see the devastation that took place, and specifically the loss of a member?
It's always tragic when a police officer, regardless of the organization they work for, loses their life in the line of duty, regardless of whether they're RCMP or municipal or provincial. It always hurts, and it always brings to the forefront the dangers that are involved in policing. And you can go from driving down the road to sheer chaos in moments. And I can only imagine the sadness and challenges that the members out there faced at the time and the chaos. It would have been significant.
Okay, I'll leave it there, Mr. Marasink. Thanks for your insights this evening. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Steve Marasink is a former major crimes investigator for the RCMP. He joined us from Edmonton. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.